The first file begins not with a map, but with a blurred photograph. A snowfield, cracked open by something vast, a crater rim glazed with ice. No coordinates are written, only the words, Event Site, Yakutia, 1962. The picture was filed under industrial accident but cross-referenced with nuclear testing archives, and yet, no nuclear detonation is recorded for that date or location. In the shadows of the photograph, if you look closely, the crater seems to pulse with light, though archivists insist it is just a damaged negative. It begins with a noise, according to those who lived closest. Reindeer herders near the Viljui River told investigators of a rumble that shook the ground for minutes before the blast. Not thunder, one insisted. Thunder comes from above. This came from below. Then came the fire. Witnesses described the sky blooming white, so bright the snow turned transparent. Forests, hundreds of kilometers away, fell flat. Trees burned from the inside out. And when the light faded, the ground where it had struck was no longer ground. It was a wound, a pit wide enough to swallow entire villages, its edges melted to glass. The Soviets moved quickly. Military convoys sealed off the region. Reports were rewritten. Newspapers mentioned only a meteorological disturbance. Villagers were relocated, their homes razed, their names erased from official census lists, yet whispers spread, carried across Siberia by rail workers and gulag survivors. They spoke of soldiers vomiting blood, of animals born with two heads, of birds dropping dead mid-flight above the crater. Western intelligence noticed. A CIA report dated August 1962, later declassified, notes massive explosive event in eastern Siberia. The document speculates on possible missile accident, but quickly dismisses it. Seismic data indicates something stranger. The energy released was too great. The signature inconsistent with fuel detonation or known warheads. One analyst scribbled a note in the margin. Second Tunguska? But unlike Tunguska, this one was hidden. Local folklore filled the gaps where science refused. The Evenki people began to call it Wat Kada, the hole of spirits. Hunters avoided the perimeter, claiming that nights near the crater were never silent. Some said the wind carried whispers, others swore they heard their own names shouted back to them from the pit. Dogs refused to approach. Shamans declared the land cursed, a place where the earth had opened to release something ancient. In Moscow, the language was colder. KGB memoranda spoke of phenomena incompatible with accepted physics. One engineer described instruments spiking into unreadable ranges, compasses spinning violently. Another wrote that the ground around the crater gave off a residual hum, perceptible through bone, but absent on recordings. The documents end with a recommendation. Further excavation suspended, area to remain classified indefinitely. But the crater did not stay quiet. In the following years, reports surfaced of expeditions disappearing entirely. A team of geologists vanished in 1965, leaving behind only a tent half torn by wind, their notebooks scattered and charred. In 1969, a helicopter crashed after circling the site 3 times. The pilot's last radio transmission was garbled, but one word was clear: Zdis Golosa. There are voices here. The Americans tried again in the 1970s, launching satellites programmed to monitor the zone. Some images made it to analysts before they were classified. They show the crater glowing faintly at night, as though light seeped from its depths. The official explanation: snow reflecting auroras. Yet analysts scribbled in margins once more: aurora does not cast shadows. What lies in the center of Siberia is neither accident nor explained. The Soviets erased villages, redacted files, scrubbed maps, but the crater remains, swallowing history. Every testimony, every blurred photograph, every missing expedition points to the same unsettling truth. Something detonated in 1962, something more than a bomb, something Moscow could not control. And the silence surrounding it is not silence at all. It is an echo, waiting, humming beneath the frost. Some say if you stand too close to the rim, you can feel it rising through your boots into your bones until it vibrates inside your chest like a second heartbeat. An invitation or a warning. This is where the file ends. A photograph of the crater clipped to a final unsigned page. One sentence typed alone in the middle. The explosion was not the end, it was the beginning. The second wave of reports begins in 1963, a year after the initial blast. A classified memorandum from the Ministry of Geology records persistent atmospheric anomalies over the crater. Aircraft flying nearby reported instrument failure, gyroscopes spinning out of control, radios filling with an identical low-frequency hum. One pilot, Lieutenant Chernov, claimed that as his Mi-4 helicopter passed over the zone, the hum transformed into words, not in Russian, but in his mother's voice, calling his childhood nickname. The crew dismissed it as stress, but the transcript of his debriefing survives. He ended the interview by whispering, "It knew me." Official expeditions tried to catalog the site, but their notes carry more questions than answers. Seismologists reported vibrations in the ground that behaved like pulses, repeating in intervals of 7 seconds. When instruments were placed closer to the rim, the pulses shortened, like something responding. Soil samples showed fused quartz and metallic residues inconsistent with any known meteor or warhead. One geologist wrote in the margin of his report, "Not impact, not explosion. It grew outward." His superior crossed it out in red ink, labeling it nonsense. Months later, the geologist disappeared during a second field visit. His colleagues found his tent empty, boots still at the entrance, untouched. His name was later removed from the university registry. Local witnesses, though silenced by soldiers, continued to share their stories among themselves. Evenki elders recalled hearing a deep ringing in their chests when they ventured near the zone. Some said it followed them home, echoing in their dreams, pulling them back. A shaman was reported to have performed a ritual at the crater's edge, attempting to seal whatever force had opened there. He collapsed during the rite and never woke. Villagers whispered that his body did not decay in the usual way, but hardened, as if petrified by frost from within. The KGB grew concerned about foreign interest. In 1964, a CIA U-2 flight detected unusual radiation signatures from the area, though the levels did not match fallout patterns. A declassified cable years later notes, "Unclear if Soviets testing new device or concealing accident. Energy profile inconsistent with fission or fusion. Possible exotic propulsion test." Analysts debated whether Moscow was attempting to weaponize the anomaly. One marginal note reads, "They're as afraid of it as we are." Yet Moscow did not abandon the crater. A secret city, codenamed Sever 9, was constructed 30 kilometers away. Gulag prisoners built barracks, laboratories, and a narrow rail spur leading toward the crater. The site never appeared on maps. Survivors of the labor detail recalled hearing strange orders shouted at night, commands to transport sealed containers from the rim back to the compound. One man, freed decades later, confessed that the crates made noises, metallic rattling, sometimes like breathing. "We knew," he whispered to an interviewer. "Whatever was in there, it wasn't dead." Stranger still are the medical records. Soldiers stationed near the crater developed identical symptoms: insomnia, bleeding gums, rapid tooth decay, and auditory hallucinations. They claimed to hear whispers, even when standing alone, the voices often familiar. Some became violent, others walked calmly into the tundra, never to return. One psychiatric report notes, "Patient insists crater is calling him by name. Attempts to restrain result in unshakable calm, as if he is already obeying another authority." Despite these mounting horrors, excavation continued. Engineers lowered cables into the crater, only for the lines to snap as if under strain. A camera probe sent down returned only blurred images of shifting light, as though submerged in water. The footage ended abruptly when the probe melted, casing fused into slag. The final frame shows a geometric pattern of glowing arcs, impossible to identify. The technician who reviewed the film resigned the same day, leaving behind a single note. It looked back. Every attempt to document the site left behind fragments of terror and confusion, until the archives themselves seemed infected by uncertainty. Some pages describe the event as a geological anomaly, others as a meteor strike, still others as classified military occurrence. The contradictions suggest one thing: no one truly knew, or if they did, they buried the knowledge so deep it may never surface. Still, one detail recurs across reports, whispered in testimonies, and scrawled in margins. The crater was not silent. It was alive, resonant, humming as though something beneath Siberia had not ended with the blast, but had only begun to stir. By 1966, the crater had become a place no one wanted to speak of, yet everyone in the Soviet Arctic Command knew of its existence. The files that survive from that year show a deepening paranoia, as if the ground itself was reshaping the men who studied it. A set of debriefings, stamped Soversheno Sekretno and stored in the Lubyanka archives, describes the last official geological expedition. The documents read like a slow descent into madness. A team of 12 geologists, soldiers, and engineers arrived at the rim in late spring. Their orders were to drill core samples from beneath the crater floor to determine whether the event was natural or technological. Within 3 days, anomalies began. The drilling rigs overheated despite freezing temperatures. Compass needles spun uselessly. One soldier noted in his log that the crater's floor seemed to change shape each morning, edges slumping, depths deepening, as if the pit was alive and subtly breathing. The strangest testimony comes from a technician named Juravlev. He insisted he heard rhythmic pounding from beneath the drill like a giant heart. At first his comrades laughed, but when the drilling equipment picked up vibrations, their amusement vanished. A report written by the expedition leader, Colonel Aksionov, confirms that the vibrations were real. He describes them as subsonic pulses, repeating with the consistency of an organic system. He urged immediate withdrawal. Moscow denied his request. 2 days later, the drilling stopped. The cables snapped, the bit disappeared into the darkness. Before retreating, the team lowered a microphone into the borehole, improvising with equipment meant for seismic surveys. The recording lasted 11 minutes. It begins with static, then a low drone. At the 7-minute mark, there is a sequence of tones, irregular but deliberate. Those who heard it described the sound differently. To some it was like distant machinery, to others like voices chanting. Aksionov himself wrote, "The sound seemed to recognize us. It altered as if in response." The recording was seized, classified, and never heard again. The expedition returned diminished. Several men developed bleeding from the nose and ears. One soldier tore out his eardrums with a pen, screaming that the crater was inside his head. Another walked calmly into the taiga one night, leaving his boots neatly by the campfire. His body was never found. Colonel Aksionov himself was reassigned to a desk job in Moscow. Months later, he fell from the window of his apartment. The fall was ruled a suicide. His widow insisted he had been healthy, but she admitted he had grown silent in the weeks before his death, listening constantly to an empty radio receiver as though waiting for a signal only he could hear. At the same time, local accounts continued to spread despite censorship. The Evenki called the crater a Katinga, a place where the earth swallowed men whole. Hunters spoke of reindeer collapsing on approach, their eyes rolling back as if seized by invisible force. One tale, repeated in whispers, tells of a hunter who leaned too far over the rim and was pulled forward by something unseen. His scream cut off instantly. His companions swore the echo of his voice carried on for hours, rising from the depths like a broken record. The Americans, too, could not ignore it. CIA files from 1967, declassified decades later, show that seismic sensors in Alaska and Japan had picked up anomalies corresponding to the Siberian blast. Analysts noted that the pulses continued intermittently for years after the initial explosion. One memo concludes, "Event was not singular. Source continues to emit." Another, more chilling, adds, "Recommend no further attempts at provocation. Unknown variable may be hostile." Back in Yakutia, soldiers stationed at Saver 9 began reporting mass hallucinations. Guards on night watch described seeing figures at the edge of camp, men in Soviet uniforms, standing silently, watching. But when approached, the figures dissolved into snow. One guard wrote in his journal, "They looked like us. Some had the faces of men we lost." The journal was confiscated, and the guard was sent to a psychiatric hospital in Novosibirsk. By the late 1960s, the Soviet government quietly declared the crater off limits, except for rare scientific inspections. The rail spur to Sever 9 was dismantled. Maps erased the region. Officially, the explosion site was a natural sinkhole, geologically unstable and dangerous. But the classified archives reveal a different reality. Internal memos warn of persistent emissions, psychological hazards, and unrecoverable personnel. The final instruction, repeated across multiple files, reads simply, "Do not attempt further excavation. Contain only." Yet containment is never perfect. Testimonies continued to leak: soldiers who could not sleep, villagers who dreamed of voices calling from the ice, researchers who insisted the pulses could be felt hundreds of kilometers away. The crater had become more than a scar on Siberia. It was an infection, spreading through memory, folklore, and classified files, always humming beneath the silence, always reminding those who knew of its existence that the explosion had not ended in 1962. It had merely opened a door, and the door had never been closed. By 1970, the files surrounding the Siberian crater had grown into a labyrinth of contradictions. Official reports describe geological instability, a collapsed salt dome, or deep permafrost rupture. But classified memos tell another story, one of mounting fear among Soviet authorities who no longer controlled what they had tried so desperately to bury. The crater was no longer seen as an accident. It was an ongoing event, one that resisted every attempt to define or contain it. A top-secret directive issued that year ordered the construction of a monitoring station disguised as a weather outpost. Gulag prisoners were marched north under guard, laying cables across the tundra, erecting radio towers that bristled like skeletons against the pale sky. Engineers installed underground bunkers lined with lead, not for nuclear fallout, but for something unstated in the documents. Soldiers stationed there were warned never to step beyond the perimeter without authorization. They called it the zone of silence. Yet silence was the one thing the crater never offered. Reports from the new outpost describe oral distortions sweeping across the tundra at night. Guards claimed to hear marching boots in the snow, though no patrols were scheduled. One wrote that he could hear the voice of his wife, calling from the darkness, though she lived thousands of kilometers away. Others reported conversations in languages they did not recognize, whispers carried on the wind, always originating from the direction of the pit. Medical files from the same period show a disturbing pattern. Personnel stationed near the crater developed identical symptoms: migraines, bleeding gums, tremors, sudden violent outbursts. Some described dreams so vivid they began to confuse them with reality. A doctor sent to evaluate the outpost wrote, "Patients insist the crater is transmitting through them. They claim to be receivers." His report was classified, and he himself was later diagnosed with schizophrenia. Colleagues whispered that he had been perfectly healthy before the assignment. Despite these incidents, Moscow demanded results. The Cold War was at its height, and rumors of American interest in the crater drove Soviet paranoia to new extremes. Intelligence reports suggested the CIA had attempted to bribe local herders for information, even sending disguised agents into nearby settlements. The KGB responded with brutal efficiency. Villages were relocated, elders interrogated, entire families vanished into the Gulag system. And yet, the Americans knew enough. A declassified CIA cable from 1971 notes, "Subject crater continues to emit unknown energy signature. Soviets conceal, not weaponize. Likely uncontrollable." Meanwhile, folklore among the Evenki and Yakut peoples darkened further. Hunters refused to pass within sight of the crater. They spoke of animals that wandered too close and returned changed. Reindeer with milky eyes, wolves that walked in circles until collapsing, birds that fell dead in mid-flight. Elders warned that the land was poisoned, not by radiation, but by memory itself. They said the earth remembered what had been unleashed, and it would not let men forget. One chilling phrase recurs in multiple accounts: "The ground speaks now." A report from 1973, preserved only in fragments, describes a failed experiment conducted at the monitoring station. Engineers attempted to bounce a radio signal into the crater and measure its echo. Instead of static, they received a perfect repetition of their own broadcast, delayed by 7 seconds but altered. The voice of the operator was distorted, pitched lower, almost inhuman. At the end of the echo, an additional phrase was added, words no one in the bunker had spoken. The transcript is censored, but a surviving margin note reads, "Not our language, yet understood by all present." The equipment was destroyed. The following winter, tragedy struck. A patrol of 6 soldiers vanished while inspecting a cable line near the rim. Their sleds and rifles were found abandoned, food still packed, engines still running. Snow around the site showed no signs of struggle, only a set of footprints leading toward the crater. The prints ended abruptly 5 meters from the edge, as if the men had been lifted into the air. No bodies were ever recovered. The official explanation, avalanche. But the terrain was flat, the snow undisturbed. That same year, foreign satellites captured unusual glows emanating from the site. At night, the crater flickered faintly, as though lit from below. Soviet authorities insisted it was reflected moonlight. Yet one photograph, leaked decades later, shows something else. Concentric circles of light forming inside the pit, geometrically precise, like the rings of a colossal eye. The image was deemed a forgery. Still, it circulated among Western analysts, many of whom began to whisper the unthinkable, that the crater was not the result of an explosion at all, but an opening. By the mid-1970s, the Soviet Union classified the entire region under a new designation, Zone P9. All maps erased it. Aerial photography was forbidden, and locals were forbidden to return. Convoys supplied the monitoring station irregularly, but the men who served there rotated out quickly, their health deteriorating after only months. The zone was a secret, but not one that could be kept forever. Stories leaked through drunken soldiers, displaced villagers, and intercepted radio chatter. The Americans knew, the locals knew, and above all, Moscow knew. Something in Siberia had slipped loose in 1962, and it refused to go back into silence. The final page of one 1975 KGB memo offers no conclusion, only dread. Typed in clean Cyrillic, it states, "Object demonstrates signs of intelligence, not human, continues to adapt, recommend indefinite quarantine, do not engage." Even now, those words feel less like a directive than a warning left behind for anyone foolish enough to keep listening. By 1976, the atmosphere in Moscow's ministries had shifted from cold analysis to quiet dread. The crater, now catalogued under multiple conflicting code names, Object V17, Zone P9, Sever Anomaly, was no longer treated as a geological curiosity, but as an adversary. Files from this year read not like scientific reports, but like battle logs, a bureaucracy attempting to fight an enemy it could not name. One operation, codenamed Omut, the Whirlpool, was launched that summer. The goal was simple on paper: lower seismic charges into the pit and measure the reverberations to determine the depth of the anomaly. A detachment of engineers from Sever 9, accompanied by KGB observers, carried out the plan. They lowered 6 charges, each rigged with redundant cabling and detonators. The records show all 6 vanished before detonation. The cables were intact, yet when reeled back, they ended in melted stubs, as though the charges had been dissolved by unseen heat. Hours later, monitoring equipment at the station captured a series of pulses emanating from the crater, 6 distinct bursts spaced evenly, like a mocking reply. That same year, personnel stationed nearby began reporting dreams so vivid they blurred into waking life. Multiple men swore they saw the same vision, a city beneath ice, towers leaning at impossible angles, glowing veins of light running through frozen walls. One officer sketched the dream in his notebook. The sketch survives in the archive. Angular structures, symmetrical yet alien, rising from a cavernous void. In the margins, he wrote, "It was waiting for us." Weeks later, he shot himself in the bunker's latrine. Medical documents detail an outbreak of what was officially diagnosed as collective hysteria, but the notes suggest something far stranger. A medic reported that his patients spoke with voices not their own, muttering phrases in archaic Russian, Yakut, and in one case, Latin. Translations revealed warnings, "It is not asleep," and "Do not dig deeper." The medic was transferred south, never to return. His replacement burned his notes after each shift, terrified that even the act of writing was a form of contamination. Foreign interest escalated. A 1977 CIA analysis, heavily redacted when declassified, states bluntly, "Soviets are not controlling anomaly. Repeated accidents suggest they fear it. Crater may represent non-terrestrial event. Recommend observation only." Another handwritten note in the margin reads, "They've opened something. God help them if it answers." Meanwhile, villagers hundreds of kilometers away continued to report strange phenomena. Herds of reindeer refused migration routes that had been followed for generations, turning in panic when the wind carried from the east. Hunters whispered of strange lights flickering over the horizon, not auroras but rigid beams stabbing upward, holding for minutes at a time. Children woke screaming, claiming they heard a voice from the ground calling them by name. Mothers stuffed cloth into their ears and prayed aloud, though no priests were permitted in the collective farms. The Soviet response hardened. In 1978, Saver 9 was reinforced with chemical troops. Declassified fragments reveal they tested aerosol dispersals around the rim, attempting to neutralize active emissions. The chemicals corroded their own equipment. Gas masks melted, rifles rusted overnight. One soldier, interviewed years later, said simply, "We tried to poison it, but it breathed deeper." The official cover story during this time was a toxic sinkhole, the result of a collapsed mine. Journalists who tried to investigate were turned back by patrols or accused of espionage, yet leaks persisted. Samizdat publications in Leningrad circulated rumors of a cursed crater where time itself bent. One anonymous pamphlet describes a herder who vanished for 3 days, then reappeared at the edge of his village. He claimed only an hour had passed. His beard had grown weeks' worth, his eyes clouded white. He died within the week, whispering the same word again and again, "Below." Inside the Kremlin, the issue became a toxic subject. Meetings of the Council of Ministers referenced the Siberian wound only obliquely, with vague language like ongoing containment and northern complications. One surviving transcript captures a moment of tension. A general warns, "If this spreads, comrades, it will not stop at our borders." The reply, cut short by redactions, hints at terror at the highest levels. It is not ours to control. By 1979, even the most loyal officers had stopped requesting further study. Files from the KGB's 9th Directorate contain a rare admission. Object displays traits of agency. Responses suggest intelligence. Recommend cessation of all active probing. It is perhaps the only time the Soviet state admitted defeat to something it could neither name nor weaponize. Yet withdrawal did not end the phenomenon. The crater continued to hum, to pulse, to infect the dreams of those stationed within earshot. The zone of silence became less an installation and more a quarantine, a scar fenced off in barbed wire and secrecy. Soldiers rotated in and out quickly, their health deteriorating faster with each year. Villages were erased, maps redrawn, files locked away. But none of it mattered. The crater remained, watching, waiting, always answering the questions no one dared ask aloud. And in the margins of one final report from 1979, unsigned and unfiled, a sentence appears in shaky type: "It knows we are afraid." By the dawn of the 1980s, the crater had ceased to be a secret merely of Siberia. It had become a shadow stitched into the very fabric of the Soviet state, a burden that no ministry wanted to carry, but none dared to abandon. The archives from this period swell with contradictions. Terse reports of routine monitoring paired with frantic handwritten notes about disappearances, failed experiments, and unexplainable disturbances. Every line reads like an argument between men who no longer believed in what they wrote. The monitoring station at Saver 9 was reduced in staff, but those who remained recorded phenomena that grew stranger with each passing year. Equipment meant to capture seismic data began instead to record structured rhythms, pulses that echoed like coded transmissions. Analysts attempted to parse them as binary or Morse, but the sequences defied translation. One technician scrawled in his logbook, "Not code, a heartbeat, a language older than us." Days later, he suffered a seizure and never regained speech. His notes were confiscated. In February 1981, a winter storm cut off the station for 11 days. When contact was finally re-established, a helicopter arrived to find only silence. The barracks were intact, heaters still running, meals left half-eaten. Every man had vanished. Snow around the site bore footprints, but they all led toward the crater and ended abruptly at the rim. The official explanation filed in Moscow was fatal exposure during blizzard. The classified addendum, however, notes the unsettling detail: uniforms and weapons left behind. Departure appeared voluntary. Local reports worsened. Evenki hunters continued to vanish, and those who returned spoke of distorted nights, auroras twisting into rigid circles above the pit, snow vibrating as if alive, shadows cast upward from the crater's depths. One elder claimed that he had seen a light below the ice, moving like an animal trapped in glass. His testimony was marked unreliable folklore, yet a KGB field agent underlined his words twice and added, "correlates with seismic anomalies." The Americans, too, took notice. A declassified National Security Agency intercept from 1982 mentions peculiar atmospheric disruptions over Yakutia. U.S. analysts speculated on experimental Soviet weaponry, but admitted in a handwritten note left unredacted, if they were testing, they lost control. CIA files reveal photographs taken by reconnaissance satellites showing faint concentric patterns spreading across the tundra, like ripples in frozen water. The Soviets dismissed them as image distortions. Privately, their own analysts described the formations as geometric echoes. Inside the USSR, the political climate was shifting. Brezhnev's health declined, and with it, the iron grip on secrecy began to loosen. Yet the crater remained untouchable, sealed under the same directive year after year: do not approach, do not excavate, contain. Some in the Politburo suggested burying it entirely under controlled demolitions, detonating megatons of explosives to collapse the anomaly. The military rejected the plan. "If it is alive," one general warned, "then burying it will only wake it." Meanwhile, testimonies from defectors began to circulate in the West. A former Soviet radio operator claimed that his unit intercepted transmissions from Zone P9 not meant for outsiders. He described hearing lists of names read in slow, deliberate tones, names of soldiers long dead, engineers who had vanished, even prisoners known to have perished in the gulags. The voices, he said, matched the missing men exactly. His story was dismissed as fantasy, yet transcripts he provided contained details consistent with classified Soviet files. By 1984, The zone had become a kind of prison with no walls. Soldiers rotated in and out with increasing speed. Most left changed, quiet, hollow-eyed, unwilling to speak of their service. Some refused to sleep in darkness. Others carried radios everywhere, even when turned off, claiming they could not bear the silence. A doctor stationed in Yakutsk wrote in his notes, "They come back as though they've brought something with them, something still listening." The final entry from this period is dated March 1985. A classified KGB summary states, "Object demonstrates escalating activity, pulses increasing in frequency. Local population exhibits heightened distress. Recommend escalation of containment measures." No details are provided, only a single sentence at the end, typed and underlined, "If it spreads, we cannot hide it." From then on, the archive grows thin. Reports become vaguer, language more euphemistic. It is as though the crater itself had infected the bureaucracy, silencing those who once tried to describe it. The silence was not the absence of sound. It was a weight, pressing down on everyone who knew the truth. And through that silence, the hum continued, steady, patient, unyielding, waiting for the next generation to hear it. By the mid-1980s, the crater had become less a location and more a presence. Every document that survived from this period reads as if the officials writing them were trying to look away while still acknowledging its shadow. The monitoring station at Severnine remained active, though its personnel rotated so frequently that no one ever stayed long enough to form attachments. The files describe the practice as necessary for mental stability. In truth, men broke quickly there, and Moscow knew it. One survivor's testimony, smuggled years later to dissidents in Leningrad, paints a picture darker than any report. He wrote that the crater's silence was never empty. It was filled with subtle sounds that pressed against the edges of the mind. At night, he swore, you could hear voices rising from the pit, not carried by air but by vibration. Sometimes they were strangers. Sometimes they were familiar. Once he heard his own voice speaking back to him. The soldier begged for reassignment after 90 days. He was granted release, but died of a stroke 2 weeks later. He was 27 years old. In 1986, a seismic event shook the region. Instruments registered a sudden pulse emanating from the crater, powerful enough to trigger alarms as far as Novosibirsk. Local villagers reported a column of light bursting into the sky, brighter than the aurora and perfectly vertical, holding for nearly a minute before vanishing. Soviet authorities classified it as atmospheric refraction, yet a classified cable from the Ministry of Defense warned, unprecedented discharge. Object appears to escalate independent of external stimulus. The timing was ominous. That same year, the Chernobyl disaster unfolded, and the USSR drowned in secrecy and fear. In that atmosphere, the crater was buried deeper in silence, overshadowed by a catastrophe too public to conceal. But some in the KGB whispered that the two events were linked, not in cause, but in consequence. The country cannot bear two wounds at once, one memo reads. Therefore, one must remain hidden. Still, Western analysts continued to pry. CIA intercepts from 1987 describe unexplained Soviet activity in restricted Yakutia zone. Satellite images showed convoys transporting unknown cargo from Severnine southward. One blurred photograph suggests containers being loaded onto rail cars at night. Speculation ranged from nuclear waste to captured fragments of meteorite. Yet the Americans could not explain why every convoy was preceded by hours of radio silence, as if even machines feared to transmit while near the crater. Meanwhile, folklore in Yakut villages turned apocalyptic. Locals spoke of the Kada, the hungry hole. Elders warned that the earth itself was sick, that it had opened its mouth and swallowed voices. Some claimed they dreamed of entire cities buried beneath the tundra, glowing with frozen light. Others said the land around the crater shifted when no one watched, that the trees leaned away from it like animals shrinking from fire. Hunters avoided the region entirely, whispering that those who heard the voices too long would never find their way back. The most disturbing files from this era come from an internal psychiatric report. Dozens of soldiers rotated out of the zone showed identical symptoms: auditory hallucinations, insomnia, and a compulsion to return. Several attempted to desert their posts elsewhere to make their way back north. When interrogated, they offered the same explanation: "It called me." One scrawled phrase appears repeatedly in their notebooks and letters: "The ground remembers." Doctors could not explain the uniformity of their delusions. As the decade closed, the Soviet Union itself began to fracture. Budgets shrank, ministries bickered, and many remote projects were abandoned. Yet not this one. Even as troops withdrew from Eastern Europe and resources vanished, supplies still flowed to Sever 9. Convoys carried food, fuel, and equipment to a station guarding nothing but snow and silence. One Politburo memo from 1989 reveals why. Failure to maintain containment may invite foreign discovery. Worse, loss of control. By then, however, control was already a fragile illusion. The crater pulsed on its own schedule, indifferent to Moscow's orders. It had devoured expeditions, infected dreams, and silenced villages. The Soviets could no longer study it, only endure it. Every file from the late 1980s shares the same final instruction, printed in stark Cyrillic: "Ne približаться, ne смотреть вниз." Do not approach, do not look down. And yet for those who had seen its rim, it was already too late. They carried the hum with them like a second heartbeat, a reminder that the crater was not finished. It was only waiting for the next collapse, the next empire to inherit its silence. When the Soviet Union finally collapsed in 1991, the crater did not vanish with the empire that had hidden it. If anything, its shadow lengthened. The sudden chaos of the new Russian Federation left archives unguarded, soldiers unpaid, secrets vulnerable. Some documents slipped into private hands, smuggled on microfilm, or sold on the black market for vodka. Others were simply lost, abandoned in empty offices. In that vacuum, whispers about the crater surged back to the surface, no longer contained by the machinery of censorship. Former soldiers began to talk, cautiously, often anonymously. One man in Novosibirsk recalled his final patrol at Sever 9, the night sky filled with streaks of pale green light, sharper than aurora, radiating from the crater itself. His unit was ordered to fire flares and stand guard until morning, though there was nothing to guard but snow. By dawn, one of his comrades was gone. His rifle lay in the drift, his footprints led to the rim, and then simply stopped. "He was called," the veteran said, chain-smoking as he spoke. "We all felt it. We just didn't answer." Western journalists, emboldened by the collapse, began digging. In 1993, a Finnish newspaper published an article titled "The Hole in Siberia That Eats Men." The story was quickly ridiculed as tabloid fantasy, but the details were too precise. References to Sever 9, to military quarantines, to glowing light under the snow. The paper retracted the article within weeks, citing verification issues. Yet those who had seen the original photographs never forgot them. Grainy images of a rim that seemed to burn faintly, even in darkness. At the same time, scavengers and smugglers began venturing north. The Soviet fences had fallen into disrepair, patrols grew sporadic, and the lure of abandoned military equipment drew desperate men. Their accounts filtered back through Siberian towns like Novi Urengoy and Yakutsk. Some claimed they found bunkers filled with broken machines, walls coated in frost that burned their skin when touched. Others spoke of radios that crackled to life without power, whispering fragments of familiar songs, then falling silent. A few never returned at all. Their snowmobiles were discovered days later, engines still warm, sleds still packed with stolen goods. But the men themselves were gone. The crater began to bleed into folklore once more. this time in new forms. In Yakut villages, children dared each other to whisper into bottles and bury them in the snow, claiming the bottles would return with different voices inside. Elders muttered that the Earth's wound had reopened, that Moscow had failed to seal it. Some even connected the collapse of the USSR to the anomaly, calling it a curse that had hollowed out the state from within. "You cannot build on land that speaks," one old man told a visiting anthropologist. The anthropologist's notes were published years later, but he himself disappeared during a return trip in 1995. Meanwhile, Western intelligence kept watch. A declassified CIA briefing from 1994 refers obliquely to persistent anomalies in Yakutia consistent with earlier seismic signatures. Analysts worried that the Russians, now desperate for resources, might attempt to weaponize the phenomenon. But the same report ends with a caution. Unclear if subject is controllable. Previous Soviet failures suggest otherwise. Privately, U.S. analysts admitted that even approaching the zone carried risks they did not understand. In Russia, the official line remained silence. The government claimed the site was contaminated by industrial waste and forbidden for ecological reasons. Yet journalists who probed too deeply often met sudden misfortune, arrest, accidents, or vanishing entirely. One Moscow reporter who investigated Sever 9 left behind a final draft on his desk. It ended with a single unfinished sentence: "The crater is not closed, it is listening." By the late 1990s, the region was once again sealed, this time by private security firms operating under government contracts. Locals noted that the new guards bore no insignia and that helicopters landed at night, unloading crates into the old bunkers. Rumors spread that foreign companies had been invited to study the site in secret, trading money and technology for access. If true, no records have surfaced. Only the villagers' testimonies remain: the sound of machinery humming beneath the snow, the glow of lights where no settlements should exist, and voices that carried on the wind when no men were present. The Soviet Union was gone, but the crater endured, indifferent to borders or governments. And as Russia staggered into the uncertainty of the new century, the pit remained what it had always been: a scar too deep to heal, a silence too full to ignore, and a reminder that some explosions never truly end. They echo forever, waiting for someone to answer. By the early 2000s, the crater had entered a new phase of secrecy. No longer guarded by conscripts in faded Soviet uniforms, it was now surrounded by private contractors and silent helicopters. Locals in Yakutia noted that the new patrols never spoke Russian among themselves, and their vehicles bore no plates. Some claimed the guards were foreigners, tall men with pale eyes, silent in the villages, buying only fuel and cigarettes. Whatever their origin, they carried equipment the locals had never seen: black cases humming faintly, antenna arrays that folded like insect legs, masks that glowed faintly in the snowlight. It was during this period that the most unsettling rumors began to surface. Hunters returning from the tundra swore they saw lights moving beneath the ice, not fire or aurora, but geometric shapes, grids, lattices, shifting patterns too regular to be natural. Dogs refused to go near, howling until their throats bled. Reindeer bolted at invisible lines, circling the perimeter without ever crossing it. A Yakut herder told a journalist, "The ground is alive. It breathes when you are not watching. And when you do watch, it breathes louder." Western intelligence reports, some later leaked, confirmed that satellites detected non-nuclear luminous activity over the coordinates in 2003. A CIA analyst described the readings as energy signatures inconsistent with any known natural or artificial phenomenon. The official recommendation was chilling: observe only, do not engage. But private contractors were already on site, digging, lowering instruments, trying to pull something from the depths. What they found, if anything, has never been disclosed. Local folklore adapted quickly to the new century. Children whispered of the Golosny Kadin, the speaking crater. They said if you stood near its rim with your phone switched off, the device would still ring. Some swore that answering the call meant vanishing forever. A teacher in a remote village confiscated one such phone. Later, when she powered it on, the only recording stored was her own voice, whispering a name she refused to repeat. In 2007, a group of amateur explorers attempted to live stream their expedition into the Forbidden Zone. The feed cut out after 20 minutes, but not before capturing a strange anomaly. Snow fell upward in the frame, flakes rising against gravity, disappearing into the pale glow of the sky. The last image showed a blurred figure standing at the rim of the crater, motionless, arms at its sides. When the authorities arrived at their last known location, the explorers were gone. Their tent stood intact, food half prepared, laptops still warm. Only the cameras were missing. By the 2010s, scattered files suggest that Moscow had grown less interested in studying the crater than in keeping it quiet. Budget reports list it only as Zone 9, Ecological Reserve. Yet, unmarked flights continued, and supply convoys still carved tracks across the tundra. Satellite images from independent researchers showed strange scars near the crater, circular patterns in the snow that appeared and disappeared overnight. Officials dismissed them as wind erosion. The researchers insisted they were too precise. Testimonies from villagers became darker. One man in 2014 claimed he saw a column of smoke rise from the pit, though there was no fire. He described it as black but glowing inside, like shadows filled with sparks. Days later, he was found drowned in the Lena River. His family said he had been sleepless for weeks, walking at night, muttering that the voices would not stop asking. Even foreign adventurers could not resist the legend. In 2016, a German journalist vanished while traveling toward the site. His last email, sent by satellite phone, contained only 3 words: "It's not empty." His belongings were later recovered by locals, but his body was never found. The crater no longer seemed like a wound to be studied or healed. It had become something else. A presence, a listening ear pressed against the skin of the earth. The Soviet Union had collapsed. Empires had shifted. Governments had risen and fallen. But the crater remained, unchanging, unyielding, whispering into the silence. And in the archives that survived, one recurring phrase keeps reappearing, whether in official reports, field diaries, or the whispered testimonies of locals. It is still answering. The most recent files, though few, suggest that the crater has not fallen silent. It has only become more patient. A classified Russian Ministry of Defense memo from 2020, leaked briefly before being erased from all official channels, describes a recurrence of anomalous discharges at the Yakutia site. Satellites detected heat blooming from the frozen pit, a pulse that registered across multiple spectrums but vanished within seconds. Ground patrols sent to investigate never reported back. Their helicopter was later found 50 kilometers away, landed neatly on a frozen lake. No crew remained. The fuel tanks were full. Locals continue to speak of strange nights. In the winter of 2021, hunters claimed they heard music drifting over the tundra, faint, distorted, like an old Soviet radio broadcast. The melody was familiar but wrong, slowed into something mournful. When they returned to their village, one man swore he still heard it in his head, growing louder each day. He disappeared a week later, leaving behind only a single sentence carved into the wood of his cabin. "It finally called my name." Unconfirmed footage circulates on the internet, shared briefly before being deleted. One clip shows the crater at night, glowing faintly from within. Snow whips across the camera, but for a moment, dark shapes seem to move along the rim. Tall, human-like but distorted, their limbs too long, their motion too smooth. Analysts who reviewed the clip disagreed on whether it was genuine. Some said it was staged. Others refused to comment, admitting off-record that no one should have been there to film it. In Moscow, the official stance has not changed. The region is closed for ecological rehabilitation. But privately, the language of the reports has grown more desperate. One heavily redacted memo warns, "Object demonstrates signs of expansion. containment insufficient. Recommend global discretion. Another line, scrawled by hand in the margin, is even more unsettling. We are no longer observers, we are participants. Folklore, too, has evolved. Among the Evenki, the crater is now spoken of as a mouth. Not a wound, not a scar, but a mouth that opened once and never closed. They warn children not to speak too loudly in the snow, lest the earth remember their voices. Hunters whisper that the pit repeats what it hears, but changes it, returns it darker, unfamiliar, as though testing how much of humanity it can imitate. For the outside world, the crater remains only a rumor, a ghost of Cold War secrecy. But for those who have stood near its rim, for those who have listened to the hum through boots pressed into frozen ground, it is something more. A presence. A reminder that explosions do not always end. Sometimes they open doors. And so the story ends where it began. With silence that is not silence. With echoes that should not exist. With questions left unanswered. Did the Soviets really try to erase a whole city, a whole event, to cover up their mistake? Or was the erasure itself the mistake? The belief that you can bury what the earth has already released? No file offers a conclusion. Only fragments, whispers, denials, and the steady rhythm beneath it all. The last surviving line, typed in faded ink on a yellowing page, reads, "It is still speaking. We must not answer." But perhaps, by listening now, by repeating this story aloud, the answer has already been given. And somewhere beneath the Siberian ice, the crater hums, waiting, remembering, never forgetting a single voice.